Let's get into it. Coach Colin here, Sold Not For Sale podcast. We got Joe Rogan and his guest talking about the Orwellian way that the media tends to act nowadays, the things that they expect you to believe, the things that they expect you to just push aside and forget about, all in the name of inclusivity, all in the name of ideology. Let's get into it right now. Do not forget about the new channel that I got, Coach Colin Media. This is where I break away from the Rogan content. Go ahead and check it out. We got about 30 videos up on there. Hit that subscribe button. We're almost at 2,000 subscribers. That's what we're looking for. Let's get into the Rogan clip.
Joined the app and he was booted out, and he really doesn't look like a woman. He is just a big bloke in a dress. And now there's a court case. There's a federal court case in America where this bloke is demanding his right to access this space. And I think what we have is this really surreal situation where even after years of feminism, and some feminism was good, right? It really did liberate women from drudgery and gave them the right to vote, gave them the right to work. I think those were wonderful leaps forward for humanity. The equalization of women with men was a wonderful thing. Some of the feminism was bad. Victim feminism. Me Too, I think, was quite hysterical and led to the demonization and punishment of men, often on the basis of no evidence at all. But generally speaking, we've had feminism for the past 100 years or so. And yet, right now, in 2024, we have a situation where if you want to be considered a good, progressive person, you have to support the right of men to cheat in sport. You have to support the right of men to go into a women's changing rooms and show people their penis. You have to support the right of men to go into a women's domestic violence shelter and demand assistance. You have to support the right of men who commit crimes, including rape, to be placed in women's prisons. And that's literally happened in the UK.
It's happened in America as well.
Right, so you have to support the right of men to invade every single space that all of us previously acknowledged as being for women only, if you want to be considered a good progressive person. That is a warping of principle of the like we haven't seen in a very long time. And I think it's really worth trying to get to grips with what's going on here.
Yeah, it's insanely bizarre. And the adherence to this ideology, even when the person's a murderer. There was a story in the New York Times about this guy who had beheaded his neighbor. You know the story?
Yeah.
It's the craziest story. It was a woman. A woman beheaded her neighbor. Like, that sounds crazy. Like, how many women chop people's heads off? Turns out it's not really a woman. It's a biological man.
That was reported in the New York Times. It was also reported in the BBC in the UK.
As a woman.
And it was a woman. On the BBC, you had to wait till the very last sentence before it said, this is a person who identifies as a woman. So most people don't read the whole article. They will just look at the first few paragraphs.
And but they don't even say biological male who identifies as a woman?
No, they just say someone. But, you know, the thing...
That's the news!
That's the news.
That's so scary.
But what's interesting to me about that story in particular is that when I read it, and I think this guy is like 80 years old. He's quite old.
He's 80, yeah.
And I remember thinking, hold on, this is really weird. 80-year-old women don't behead women. I've never heard of anything like that in my life. 80-year-old women tend to be pretty frail, usually quite small. They don't usually have the strength to do something as grotesque as that. And then you discover halfway through the article in the New York Times, at the very end of the article in the BBC, that it's a bloke. Of course it's a bloke.
Of course it's
right. But this is where we really get to the Orwellian stage of what's going on right now, because this is the sacrifice of news to ideology. And that is literally the storyline of 1984. Winston Smith's job in 1984 in the Ministry of Truth is to rewrite news articles to ensure that they accord with the ideology of the party. And that's literally what's happening right now. News articles are being rewritten. The truth is being sucked out of them. The truth in this case was that an 80-year-old man murdered a woman. And he had murdered women previously, in fact. That was the truth. The truth was sucked out and it was replaced with a lie. And the lie was that an 80-year-old woman had beheaded a woman. So you have this profoundly Orwellian interference with truth and reality, this remolding of reality so that it suits the ideology of the ruling class. And that is right out of 1984. That really is the stuff of dystopia. And that is indicative of, I think, of where we're at right now.
It's also indicative of a condition that takes place when people are under extreme duress, where they sort of they give in to ideologies much easier. And, we really saw that during COVID. COVID, people just gave in, and all of a sudden, like, here's another one, trust the pharmaceutical drug companies to not lie, which was never the case. Nobody trusted them before that. If you had polled people in 2017, like after the Vioxx scandal and after we knew about the opioid crisis and the Sackler family and all, if you polled people back then and asked them what their faith in the pharmaceutical drug companies was and how many of them do you think are lying, oh my God, it'd be off the charts. Most people distrust them. Most people wouldn't think they'd be telling the truth. And then it switched over to, if you don't trust them, you're a Nazi.
Yeah.
You're a fascist. You should die. We hope you get the disease and die. You're a plague rat. And that is just immediately going into climate change. And a lot of the same hysterical people who were up in arms about people's non-willingness to participate in experimental medication now are like, if you don't 100% support climate change, you don't drive an electric car, you're not doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, you're on the wrong side of everything. You're on the wrong side of history. And if you try to corner those people and ask them for something is like so interesting and fascinating about climate, it's so bizarre that that one got attached so like rigorously to ideology. Because it's a fascinating conversation. Like what is the difference between us surviving and not surviving? Like what degrees hotter would it get where we'd be fucked? What degrees colder would it get where we'd be fucked? Like how lucky are we that we're on this planet that's protected by a moon that's the perfect distance from the sun? Like holy shit! Like, this is fragile.
But what's interesting about both of those issues, COVID and climate change, is that what people will say is that in a time of crisis, we can't afford the luxury of dissent.
Or we can't afford you, but you don't even understand it. That was my point. It's like these people that will argue like violently that you should adhere to climate. When you start asking them questions like, what percentage of carbon is in the atmosphere? Like, what is the consequences of it raising or lowering? What's the negative consequences of it lowering?
But they can't answer that.
They don't know.
And the thing is that, you know, my retort to those people on both of those issues, COVID and climate change, is that it's precisely in a time of crisis or a challenge to society or some problem, external problem that could cause problems for us. It's precisely in that time that freedom of speech and the right to dissent and the right to express alternative views becomes more important, not less important.
Yes.
And what happened with the outbreak of COVID in March 2020 is that the opposite position was taken by governments across the world. And what they essentially said was, this is a serious virus. It's a modern day plague. We can't afford any form of dissent. We can't afford any form of questioning or any deviance from the lockdown narrative, and therefore we will punish it severely as and when it arises. That was entirely the wrong approach, because if you're going to lock down a whole society, in the UK, we were put under house arrest. We were allowed to leave our homes once a day. A hotline was set up by the cops so that you could report your neighbours if they left their house more than once a day. It was a completely surreal situation where we had the utter decimation of civil liberty in a way that had not happened ever before in the history of our country. And yet we were told this is not the time to raise questions. This is not the time for debate. Debate is a luxury that we can't afford until we go back to normal. That is utterly wrong. It's precisely when there is an issue facing our society, a real confronting problem, that we need to have as free a discussion as possible in order that we might have made the right decision in March 2020, in my view, which is that rather than locking down, we should have had a Swedish-style scenario where people were given advice, you know, you might not want to go here, you might not want to go there, but we're going to leave schools open, we're going to let you make your own decisions. Trusting people to make their own decisions, galvanizing people to come together as a community in order to help those who might be affected by COVID. That would have been a far better alternative to this brutish locking down of the entire of society so that people's freedom was completely and utterly crushed. But it's a good example of how when you sideline debate, when you restrict freedom of speech and freedom of dissent, you end up with really tyrannical situations. Puberty blockers, the net zero hysteria, the COVID lockdowns, all of those in some ways are a product of crushing dissent, crushing freedom of speech, restricting people's right to put their hand in the air and say, hold on, is this the right thing to do? So freedom of speech, I think, is essential to all of these questions and the right of our society to do the right thing rather than making these terrible mistakes.
Without a doubt. And that was one of the most terrifying things about the Twitter files, was finding out that our own government was involved in limiting the freedom of speech of experts, of people from Stanford and Harvard who were dissenting about the way things were handled during the pandemic. That you're literally deciding that some of the smartest people on earth shouldn't be allowed to talk because they don't fit this narrative that we all need to follow in order to survive. I'm hoping that most people woke the fuck up after that. And even if you went along with it in the beginning and you haven't apologized or you haven't consented to the fact that you were incorrect, even if you haven't just accepted it entirely, there's a part of you that knows the world got fucked over.
There should be. There definitely should be. I know some people that should be admitting that to themselves and also apologizing to the people around them. Can you imagine all the people who yelled at other people because they didn't have a mask on properly? How many fights in grocery stores, banks, you're not 6 feet this, you're not that. Absolutely wild. But getting to the Orwellian side of things, it's so it's right out of 1984. Everything that we're seeing right now, you know, like right now, war is democracy. Criminals are the oppressed and their victims. right? And they should be able to do what they're doing. Good people are compliant, when in reality, a good citizen is someone who questions things and thinks, because that's better for a community and that's better for an entire country and that's better for the world. Weakness is considered strength. The weaker you are, the more that you can't do yourself is considered some kind of strength. The more you can put yourself in victimhood, you are seen as this stronger person, and people who work out are somehow connected to white supremacy. That's a real thing. That was a real article that got put out, you know? Really changing things, because I guarantee you any articles that were written about working out 15 years ago never had any link to white supremacy. But today the narrative's changed. And once the narrative changes, everything has to change. And how dare you even consider looking to the past and figuring out what was once said? How dare you do that at all? And then inclusivity. Inclusivity is tolerance, intolerance. That's what you do. In order to be inclusive, you have to become intolerant. In order to be inclusive of people in the LGBTQ space, you have to become intolerant of straight white males or just straight cis people in general. It's absolutely crazy. So in order to include people, you have to exclude people. You know, just perfect example, The Little Mermaid. Changing it to a black person. Right now there's a new movie, Romeo and Juliet. They've changed Juliet to a black woman. It's just, they just keep on doing this. They keep on altering, exactly like Winston Smith. I love that he brought that up, because I would love to bring that up right now as well. Just looking at that quote, you know, Winston Smith, his actual job. This was his actual job. The process of continuous alterations was applied not only to newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. That's exactly what's happening today. That's exactly what happened with Candace Owens. Let me play this for you. Candace Owens was called out for saying that Ukraine was corrupt. And how dare she remember what was said in the past? This ended up happening. Listen to this.
Candace Owens is completely unafraid of anyone, so she's often accused of things. The New York Times, in its latest salvo, is accusing her of working for Vladimir Putin. A reporter just wrote to Candace Owens, quote, "We note you have advanced the idea that Ukraine was a corrupt country, which matched comments we've seen from Russian state media." Calling Ukraine corrupt is Russian propaganda. So here's what Candace Owens wrote in response. "I'm very confused by this email. I learned about Ukraine's corruption from the New York Times. As just one example, here is a piece from the New York Times editorial board entitled, 'Ukraine's Unyielding Corruption.'" Greatest response ever. Founder of the charity Blexit, Candace Owens joins us now. That is just too great. How did they respond to you, Candace?
I mean, I also sent them even more links. I mean, that was just one link that I sent them, but there's 10, 20 links between the Washington Post and the New York Times over the last 3 or 4 years telling us about how unyielding the corruption is and really spelling out to us how corrupt President Zelensky is, but they've magically changed their mind. So I was confused. Maybe Russian disinformation means now for the New York Times truth, given the Hunter Biden laptop scenario, which they called Russian disinformation and they now acknowledge is fully true. Obviously, he responded and said, "Thank you for sending these links," and then completely moved the goalposts and asked me whether or not I accepted the official government narrative regarding biolabs and whether they were just opened for research. And I said, "This is completely nonsensical. What does this have to do with your initial question?" And then I sent him another link and I said, "Is that the official government narrative regarding biolabs? Is it for research? Because you guys also told me in another article that they were funding these labs to shut down previous Soviet labs." And then he just said, "Thank you for your time. No more questions." Because I don't think he's reading the New York Times and doesn't realize how many times they pivot the narrative. And here's the thing. Nobody believes this Russian puppet stuff. I mean, it's just ridiculous. A black woman in the United States, have never even been to Russia. I mean, I can't think of a Russian food off the top of my head. I mean, it's so ridiculous. I refuse to give it any air. But they say these things when you arrive at a truth that they don't want them looking at, that they don't want the public at large looking at. They say, "Oh, looky over here. Never mind, this person's a Russian puppet." Exactly like they did with the the Hunter Biden laptop until they were ready to acknowledge the truth. So I really tried to reflect on what it was that I was hitting at that was bothering them. And really, it was me talking about Zelensky. You know, Zelensky right now, according to the mainstream narrative, the new mainstream narrative, I should say, is Batman, right? We're all supposed to just go, he's an amazing hero and he's not corrupt. And I've been talking about their previous covering of him in the Pandora Papers, talking about his ties to, you know, Ukrainian billionaires have a controlling interest in Burisma. That might be a significant conversation for the press to have in a moment when we have Biden's administration egging us on, trying to get us more involved in this conflict in Ukraine, and they don't want that conversation to be had. So instead, they're going with a black female from the United States is somehow on Putin's payroll, which is just pointedly ridiculous.
Oh, I know the feeling. Russian disinformation. So the Biden family's patron's in trouble. The U.S. military has to save him, but mentioning that, not allowed. Candace Owens, fearless.
They didn't change their mind. She said they magically changed their mind. They didn't change their mind. The narrative changed. Once the narrative's changed, once the administration says this is what it is now, Zelensky is now, he's now Bruce Wayne. He is now Captain America. You should treat him as such. He's a hero. You have to look at as a hero. And he fights for democracy. That's not what they were saying before. But once it changes, that's it. That's why there's so many people who knew what a man was and knew what a woman was. And now that's been completely flipped. And they want you, just like 1984, to ignore what your eyes and ears are telling you. A guy like me can be standing in front of you and I say, I'm a lady. And there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. And if you dare question me, you're a bad person. You're a bad person. The power is in tearing up human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Another quote from 1984. It's exactly what's going on. So when this guy, Brendan O'Neill, on the Joe Rogan podcast says it's very Orwellian, it very much is. You know, 2 + 2 is 5. And they'll just look at you and say 2 + 2 is 5. Ignore your eyes, ignore your ears. Ukraine's not corrupt. Russia's the enemy. They're just the enemy. Don't look into it. Okay? Yes, there's a journalist who's about to interview him and about to ask him some questions. Don't watch that. In fact, that person who did that interview, he's not a journalist. That Tucker, he's not a journalist at all. Why would you even listen to him? And in fact, he's actually connected to far-right extremists. You're not a far-right extremist. Turn the TV off. Forget it. Turn your computer off, your phone. Turn it all off. That's what they're doing day by day. It's not just to Tucker. They'll do it to Candace. They'll do it to Joe. They'll do it to everybody. Russell, Jimmy, anyone you can think of. When they need the narrative to change, the narrative will change. That's why I tell people, I've had conversations so many times, keep your dictionaries. Go find a dictionary from the 50s. Keep it. Find it from the 40s. Just keep it. And as they change the meaning of things, as they keep on altering things over and over and over and over again, keep that. Keep that physical copy. Don't do any Kindle nonsense because they change that and you wouldn't even know it. You hit the terms and services, and within the terms and services, they're allowed to alter whatever they get a hold of if they need to. Whatever they're giving you, if they need to. So it's just very, very interesting, you know, especially when he brought up the whole Orwellian thing. I mean, it sucks for me. I didn't read that book until now with my wife. But if you've read that book and you're not shocked, or you know, maybe you're used to it by now, but if you're not shocked by what you see in that book and then what you see in reality, it's wild. It's exactly what's happening today. And all you can do is continue to question things. You know, I did an episode just yesterday, or maybe it came out today, and it was about cancel culture and what they're doing to J.K. Rowling. And this actually goes hand in hand with it because all she's doing is stating the way things have been. You know, in that video, they talk about how she's always swept up in these controversies. There's always something just going around. And then when you actually read the story, she just misgendered somebody. And that's the whole controversy. That's the terrible thing. That's the thing that's getting her attacked time and time and time again. But all she's doing is just saying exactly what a person would say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. She's just saying what we've all known. And that's why it's so important for her and others to stand up in the face of that whole thing, because it will just keep going further and further and further and further. It won't stop. The more that you give in, the more you know what reality is, and you give into this alternate reality that they keep on trying to paint and push on us, the more they'll just keep doing it. They'll just keep building it and building it and building it. And before you know it, you'll have no idea. It will look, you're living in a completely different place. And for sure, I'm in my 30s. For sure, there's someone in their 60s who's like, I don't even know what this place is anymore. You know, I was talking with my now accountant, and I was talking about how I'm seen as conservative, very right leaning, but then older people will be like, oh, you're like a classic liberal. That's what you are, because this is all your thought processes. That's what the Liberal Party used to be about. And he said, he's an older gentleman, and he's like, the reason you have so many older people watching you, he's like, because the country's not even recognizable anymore. It's completely different. It's completely changed. And those changes happen bit by bit. It's like Jordan Peterson said in that video, they push you just a little bit until you protest, and then they back off. But they don't let you come back. They don't do that. You stay there. They come here and they just back up a little bit. And then they come back again and they push you a little more. And then you protest and they go, okay. But you still stay there. And they keep on doing that until you're a football field away from where you started. And you have no idea what happened. Because you feel like, well, at every turn I protested. But did you take back the ground after? See, that's what J.K. Rowling is doing. She's taking back ground. There's a law that pops up. She says, arrest me. Do it in front of the world. I want the whole world to see you arrest me because I said the wrong pronoun for a person. And I actually said the right one, but now you're telling me it's the wrong one. It's been the right one for decades and hundreds of years, but now all of a sudden it's the wrong one. You're going to take me to jail. Please do so. And a lot of us can't afford to do anything like that. She's pretty much a billionaire, right? So I'm not expecting you to do what a billionaire would do. But I'm just saying, in everyday life, when this stuff comes up, you have to take back ground where you can. I'm not telling anybody to go and get fired. I know how hard it is to come by a job, and I know how hard it is to get by. I'm doing it myself. But yeah, everything that's happening right now is very interesting. You know, it really is 2 + 2 is 5. And then they tell you math is racist. That's a real thing. I'm not making that up. It sounds silly. It is silly. They tell you math is racist. And 2 + 2 could be 5. And if you were a more open-minded person to the fact that it's 5, well, then maybe you wouldn't be such a bigoted, hateful person to begin with. It's amazing the things that they pull off as they build this alternate universe. You know, it's very, very wild. You know, what happened with Riley Gaines. That's a perfect example. Riley Gaines even talks about it. She was like, there was this woman and she was just beating all these records and nobody had heard of her. And we were all like, who is this lady? And every single news article was leaving out the fact that this Leia wasn't born Leia. They were just leaving that out. They were like, this lady's doing great. This lady's doing great. And then finally, Riley walks up and 6'4", long-haired Leia standing in front. And she's like, okay, pretty sure this is a guy. Can't say that. Yeah, how much more are we not going to be able to say? You know? What else are they going to end up taking away? What would be the line for people? For Jordan Peterson, it was the pronouns. For J.K. Rowling, it seems like it's the pronouns as well. Where's your line at? And then how do you stand tall at that line? I guess that's the real thing you have to figure out. Where is your line and where do you stand tall on it? What won't you do? A lot of us figured out that the line can become very real. Just 4 years ago, we all got confronted with the line. And some of us allowed them to just push that line over us. And some of us stood tall and said, no, that's the line. We don't do that. And that emboldened a lot of people. They said, I'm not going to, you know what? There's a lot of lines that I think you've been crossing. I'm not going to let you cross anymore. And some people just get real compliant because they get real scared. And you have to decide which you're going to be. Because if you read 1984, and again, you know, it could be put right alongside the book of Revelation. Because that's a real thing that's happening right now. And you see what those characters went through. And we're living in what seems to be the precursor. What happened before 1984 became that whole world that Orwell built. It seems like that's where we are right now. They're slowly pushing us towards that world. And again, I bring it up all the time. In mass formation, you can't stop talking in public on the ground floor. You can't go underground if you feel a certain way. You cannot do that. Because that's when all of this weird ideology takes over, because there's no voice to shake people awake. Right? There's no voice to shake people away. I've talked about it before, the 10-80-10 rule. 10% of the people are going to point out the nonsense that's going on in the world. 10% of the people are going to say it's not nonsense. This is what you do to be a good person and you better comply. And then there's 80% that could go either way. And every time that 10% speaks up, it shakes the 80% awake a little bit, and more come over to your side. And, you know, and we'll call it how it is. The left, they're professional complainers. They do it the best. And as they keep on doing it, they keep on getting more people to their side. And you have to actually keep speaking up, because if that 10% that stands up and actually sees what's going on goes away, that 80% just gets taken over by that other 10%. I'm not good at math. I think that made sense. Not good at math, but I know 2 + 2 is 4, and I won't let go of that. There has to be some things in life that you just won't let go of. Some things that you know to be true that you will not let go of. Things that you know serve society in a good way that you will not let go of, because if you do, it will only help society as we know it right now erode even more. Anyways, guys, 1984, go and read that book a little bit, because it's exactly where we are right now. Haven't even started talking about Iran and Israel right now. I'm going to go do another video about that on the other channel, that's for sure, because it's getting pretty heated. But I'll cover it when Rogan brings it up. Listen, guys, like, subscribe, share. I got a second channel, link in the description. Other than that, I'm out.